Thank you. So, hello everyone. Oh yeah, slides are up. All right. I want to speak about the Porter's RPC gateway today and how we are making RPC gateways work for Web3 developers. Now, RP what? I don't know who of you have used an RPC. Hopefully, some of you. So we're gonna dive a bit into what an RPC is, then why we should care, and then we'll shift more into the DePIN side of things, and lastly we'll talk a little bit about our take on how we make RPC work for Web3 developers. Now, I came across, when I was looking at RPC and what, in the Ethereum or Web3 world, how they do it, I came across like the people and the papers that, design RPCs. So my question now, what does a printer and Ethereum have in common? Anyone struggled getting something to print at like a printer they weren't previously connected to? Well, chances are that it was because of RPC. Because printers and Ethereum do use RPCs in order for you to not have to run a node to participate in the network. So, long story short, a remote procedure call connects two systems that don't know anything about it, that don't share memory, that do not communicate other than over a very narrow socket. And this is a problem, but it's also an opportunity because you don't have to bring networks very close together or, applications using the same memory, but you can have two entirely separate systems that can now communicate. So probably a more common example where you would encounter that is when you add a network to your MetaMask. So you would basically, that actually works, you would basically put your RPC in here, and you have to do this because your Web3 wallet, your client, doesn't know anything about the state of the blockchain. It doesn't use RESTful API or anything. It's just you have to actually manually put it there. Now, why is that a problem? And especially if we go back, why is I think the presentation crashed. Can you maybe go on full screen again? Okay, anyway, when we look at the RPC aspect in the back, so actually the web address, then you can see that you're relying on nosischain.com. So if nosischain.com is lying about the state of the blockchain, you have a problem. So now we don't want to lie today, and therefore we have a single source of truth now back up and running. Anyway, why is this a problem? So the problem is that you have, or that you introduce a single point of failure. So you have your RPC service that kind of sits in the middle between the blockchain and its peers and the dApp you're using, or the client. It can be your MetaMask wallet, it can be any other wallet, it can be your dApp that you're building and that you really want to work. Because when you launch, you better make sure that no one is lying about whether your transactions are going through or not. So this can be alleviated by decentralizing the man in the middle, the RPC service. And the RPC service is there because if you are a consumer or a dApp builder, you want to focus on your use case. You want to focus on getting your job done. You want to focus on sending that money to a friend, but you don't want to run a node. And essentially, you have to run a node or you have to rely on RPC services. in order to make that call, make that relay, just post that transaction, and then also know when it's completed. So I don't know who of you has been around. Like 2 years ago, MetaMask and Consensus updated their terms and conditions and their privacy policy, and all of a sudden started linking IP addresses with Web3 addresses. So when you have a client that actually shouldn't and doesn't know anything about the state of the blockchain, and then you have Infura as like an RPC provider, and they're both run by the same company, all of a sudden it's not so decentralized anymore. So it actually poses a risk to trust that RPC provider, to trust that client, and to trust that they're not one and the same entity. So this is where DePIN comes into play. And like the person speaking before me, he was going about IoT devices and like all this fancy stuff. But this is a side of DePIN that might be a bit more boring, but something that you actually encounter daily, and not when you are on a train and you see like a weird NFC kind of symbol saying that, you know, there is an IoT device. So we also heard a bit of like a background about what DePIN is, but essentially DePIN are cryptoeconomic systems. So you have like a mechanism that organizes different actors that are predominantly interested in their self-interest, and you bring them together without them having to trust each other, and introducing a modularity by having several actors that allows for the system to adapt, to adopt, and basically to not have to rely on like one actor or like, you know, contractual like obligations or constructs that put everyone in place. So when we speak about RPC networks, so different peers that are organized according to a consensus mechanism that programmatically come together to find an agreement on what should be relayed to a given network or should be sent back based on a request that was made. There are a few, but we have been working with Pocket Network, and they call the process of like basically posting transactions from a client to a network and getting data back a relay, and coming together and making that like having nodes doing this together, they call relay mining. And they contrast like their model. I think they have a couple of thousand nodes all over the globe. There are some weak spots, predominantly in Africa and Latin America, where like not so many nodes are located. But overall, they have several thousand nodes compared to maybe 50 or 100, like a middle to like large RPC, centralized RPC provider has running for any given network. And this is fairly optimistic. So Pocket Network brings together all these thousands and thousands of nodes that basically agree on what should be sent to a client, to a DApp, or what should be posted on a network. So in any, like for any like relay to be propagated, you need at least 24 different parties coming together. And 24 is like by default much larger than what you would have if even you were running your node, right? So there is just one problem. By having a network on top of a network, again, anyone wanting to post to that network needs to be part of it. So essentially, what you need is you again need to be a participant, and that's an issue. So that's why Pocket introduced something what they call gateways. These are essentially re-centralizing points or points of confluence where like a consumer or a builder can choose between any of them, but they essentially would get something what they would expect as like what an RPC endpoint looks like. So we are basically describing a shift from centralized node as a service providers back to like a decentralized network acting as one but being many. So why do we do this? Why do we work with Pocket? Because it enhances privacy. It maybe offers anonymity for someone who's super careful. But it definitely offers pseudonymity, and it enhances your availability because you can actually tell the network, well, I'm located here. Please pick the closest node or the closest nodes in order to make that relay. So this is where we come into play, Portis. So Portis is basically an RPC gateway. So we sit on top of the Pocket network and kind of bring together like the strengths of the network, but making it more accessible. So this is an authoritative take on how you should do RPC gateways or decentralized RPC networks, and it's maybe necessary to make a distinction. So on the left hand, on the left hand side, we have like a rough stack. So like the Portis dApps, it's somewhere in between. Then you have a dApp that you build, and you have Portis where you can configure your RPC endpoints. Then there's Pocket, and then underneath you have a DLT or a blockchain, depending on what you want to call it. But essentially, data moves up and down the stack. And now you could say, well, but Portis seems pretty centralized. I mean, you're sitting there and like you're kind of guarding, and that's a fair critique. But when we actually look what decentralized means, we need to distinguish it from distributed networks. So underneath, like you have distributed network. That can be Pocket, that can be Ethereum mainnet, and then on top of it, you have decentralization, because like one of the, let's try this again, hopefully it doesn't crash again. So you have like one of these thicker nodes, and that is essentially what is like the dark brown node here, meaning that we decentralize on top of a distributed network. And I think this isn't appreciated enough. It isn't appreciated enough that decentralized doesn't mean the same as distributed, that there is a distinction, yet at the same time, they can very well integrate and work together. So essentially, we are a confluence on a decentralized network that uses or that relays data to a distributed network, essentially Ethereum or other blockchains. Now, why do we do all of this? Why do we need to introduce yet another layer in between? Aren't there already enough layers? Well, you could argue yes, there are, but also, we want to reach more than like the people here. And this means that we need to get a lot more like what it used to be, more easy, faster, more seamless. And corporations and consumers do like Web2. Like they do like the experience. It's something they are familiar with. So we need to make an effort to make it more seamless. And at the same time, for developers working in the space, you don't want to always use your credit card. I mean, let's say you're working for a client. You're building this app, and then you hand it off at some point, and you have to put your credit card in order to make this fly. And when if and when this app goes live while you're still in the project, like it's your credit card info, and it's your relays. You're going to pay for it. Whereas with Portis, it's just as simple as buying a voucher, meaning a token, and redeeming it. Anyone can do this. Anyone can airdrop you this token, and you can pay for it. There's no data, no personal data linked back to you other than maybe your IP address. There's nothing that stops you from going out, getting a grant, and putting it directly into RPC relays or credits without having an additional hop or anything in between. So this is how it looks, what we have built. So roughly we have like the user, and the user might be a misnomer. Essentially, these are the developers. We have the portal. We have the finance aspect of it. So this is like the payment smart contract, and kind of interfacing with the actual RPC that is in the bottom right corner. There are a couple of databases, and actually the challenge we faced were like making them all talk to each other and making sense of the data they were getting, and rate limiting at the correct point in time, rate limiting to the extent that was desirable, and also caring for developers, because we went out there, we looked at what people were building, and apparently developers in Web3 don't like backends. So what we saw is that like many applications essentially were having the secret that is required in order to access an RPC endpoint was in the client-sided software code, so not really secure. So we had to take this into account, which essentially led us to, which essentially led us to introduce rules. So instead of giving like a vanilla RPC endpoint, we introduced the concept of apps, meaning that an RPC endpoint is just one aspect or one way to interfacing. And you can be way more granular about how you want like these RPC relays to be governed. So essentially, you could think of porters as something like alchemy, but more decentralized. We don't like to call it this way, but apparently it's what people understand. And to that end, we are thinking about something that is called portals. So like the porters are governing the portals, and this is essentially in order to serve developers coming into Web3 that might have like a Web2 background. So we're currently working together with a project called Token Name Service. So essentially they are the decentralized alternative to something like CoinGecko or CoinMarketCap. And together we are building a token API, which essentially is a RESTful API, so it's super easy to integrate. It is not as decentralized, but the data that is underneath doesn't come from like a centralized entity, it doesn't come from CoinMarketCap or CoinGecko, but it actually comes from like an army of contributors putting in this data and making it available. So essentially what we're doing is we're just making it more easy to access rather than centralizing the entire stack. So this also helps by bridging the gap between Web 2 and Web 3 by just mixing and matching it how developers need it and want it in order for consumers to be able to use it the most seamlessly. So yeah, if you want to try it out, Porter's your gateway to Web3. But I mean, basically, we're looking for feedback, and we're looking to see how we can, slice it up differently or make it work so that it's not just Pocket or Porters, but Web3 at large that benefits from mixing and matching Web 2 and Web 3 under the premise that we are decentralizing and relying on nodes that are not run on the server, but by enthusiasts with their dApp node all across the world. Thank you very much.
Hi. Okay.
All right.
Yeah. So the big question is, so you touched upon this. So you're sort of have this decentralized network of RPC, basically no providers, and then you're sort of centralizing it in this gateway. So is there anything stopping porters from having the same privacy issues as Infura, for example? So what I'm asking is, can porters in theory still sell data later on?
Well, I mean, theoretically, yes, of course. But you need to look at what kind of data porters actually get. And we had this problem. So we do want, for example, to allow users to have an invoice, right? Because for many of our people, for many of our users, it's important that they can, like deduct these costs like from their revenue in order to, not pay tax on, costs they spend. So we wanted to, make this simple invoice, and we realized, well, actually, we don't have like a lot of data. So when we were thinking about VAT or value-added tax, GST, we didn't have any of this. Yep. So essentially, what all that Porters has is something that you could query from the blockchain. So we have a payment token that essentially is just bought to be burned. To facilitate payments, you can also directly redeem or swap on the spot. And there's this transaction ID, the identifier, and the IP address, but there's nothing more.
Thanks.
Anyone else with a question? Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.